Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Now, Mark Rutte has taken over as NATO's 14th Secretary General, bringing a wealth of experience as the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands. His tenure comes at a pivotal time for the alliance, with challenges such as the war in Ukraine, rising defense costs, and geopolitical tensions with China and Russia. How will his years of coalition building and European diplomacy help NATO navigate these turbulent waters? Joining us today on TVP World to discuss this is Robert Pszczel, a senior fellow at the Center for Eastern Studies. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for the invitation.
Good to have you in the studio. Now, before we dive into the NATO topic, we just have breaking news about Iran firing over, hundreds of rockets into Israel. And I was hoping that I can get your quick take on this particular topic. Where do you think that things are going right now?
Well, I mean, I think as the experts, real experts, I think on the region spoken before this part of the program. I mean, there is it was not unexpected. There is expectation. This may be not the last word, not from Israel. Right? Looking at this from a really kind of more global perspective, even from, let's say, NATO's point of view, and certainly from the vantage point of our region, obviously, the more countries, particularly like the US, are engaged and even more broadly in the international community, if you like, has to focus in terms of political attention, but also to some extent resources, depending how it and a situation develops. Of course, that takes away, attention and resources from the other parts of the world, including, for example, Ukraine. It's not a straight of trade-off, but nevertheless, that's something that has to be taken into account, and that, I'm afraid, is something that is taken into account by the countries which are essentially today, one has to call them NATO's adversaries, in particular Russia.
Right. It does seem like a conflict is being waged on multiple fronts, and there's a lot of attention needed on many fronts of the situation, where it does invite a little bit of instability, does it?
Of course. I mean, and I don't want to play down the importance because we're talking about, human life, security of Israel and the countries, conflict. It's a bad thing. People get killed and it has consequences, economic and others. But also from a political point of view, these conflicts have, a dangerous potential, apart from this attention span that I mentioned, that it could lead to some divergences in terms of the policy approach. And talking about the US, of course, is in the throes of the election, right, where support to Israel is quite a strong element in that campaign. And of course, many number of European countries, let's put it this way, may have slightly different view on, for example, what's happening in Gaza and in general Israel's policy. So that's also a bit of political risk. But so far, we are where we are, and that situation needs very serious monitoring, because these days everything is somehow connected.
Right, very much so. So we do have to see how this develops. Meanwhile, let's go back to our original topic, because we are looking at a new NATO Secretary General. Now, what are some of the specific challenges do you think Rutte will have to face in increased defense spending and, like we're talking about turbulent times, right? Mm-hmm. So organizing this military alliance through this very turbulent waters.
Well, let me first start to say something which may be obvious, but maybe not necessarily so. I mean, the job of the Secretary General of NATO has kind of become harder and harder. Why? Because, first of all, it's a different situation, obviously in the world, of course, but, it requires much greater energy, to be very frank, because you have to focus on so many things. Things are not kind of maybe dangerous, but sort of stable. No, we're dealing with a lot of unpredictability. That means you have to employ a whole array of skills. So the Secretary General has to be a supreme diplomat, has to be a good mediator if need be, has to adjudicate, has to also be a kind of mobilizer in chief, because a lot of the things that was mentioned in your report before, countries need to be nudged, let's put it delicately, if not more, into spending more. The Secretary General, of course, has limited powers per se, but he is a chairman of the North Atlantic Council and all different levels. The fact that it's the third in a row former prime minister means that he will be talking primarily to his kind of colleagues, which does matter. The Secretary General is a spokesperson, essentially, is the face, is the voice of NATO, and that's important too, because you have to explain, not just to the elites, if you like, political class, but the general public. And, the situation, we have the biggest war going on in Europe since 1945, and people have to understand that NATO is actually the best bulwark, the best insurance, if you like, that no even bigger war breaks up. But the paradox is that you have to actually take some steps which, NATO's adversaries will inevitably portray as, confrontation. Why? Because you have to increase defense spending, because you have to do more military exercises. And frankly, you have to explain to the general public that the fact that, we're dealing with such challenges, and we know what's happening in the war against Ukraine with the predators. Russia is a predator, but it's supported by China, So again, there is a link to what's happening in the Pacific as well. And all this means that people have to think about these issues in a different way. And one of the most obvious ways in which this affects everybody is the question of taxes, obviously, but also the fact that in some countries, there's serious thinking about reintroducing conscription, etc. So Secretary General has to kind of do all this, and by the way, manage, not a huge, but still relatively important, I would say. I was part of it, international service located in NATO HQ, and all this has to be done in terms of the relationship, which is crucial, which is a political or civilian and military as well. So there's a lot of expectations and a lot of things. So Rutte, he's now become today the Secretary General. He has to hit the ground running. There's no time, by the way, for him to kind of get introduced. So let's hope he's up to the task. NATO has been not just lucky, but the choices it's made, in terms of selection of Secretary General were rather good. I've worked with these 4 Secretary Generals, I have to say, each one being very different, but they all brought a lot of skills and they had a lot of successes. But ultimately, and that's also something which needs to be said, it's not the Secretary General himself will not be able, of course, to decide the fate of the alliance. He can help, he can rally the troops, so to speak. But ultimately, the key decisions lie in the capitals of the now 32 nations.
Right, like you mentioned earlier, there's this kind of paradox here where it's almost like that joke with the IT department. When everything is working, people are asking, why do we need it? But when things are not working, we say, why are we paying for this if it's not working? But like you mentioned also, it is very important to kind of explain to the populace why NATO is such a necessary and important organization. Do you think that Mark Rutte's experience as Prime Minister will give him what it takes to convince the populace or even other countries to get on board with that 3% mark?
Well, sometimes it's a question almost like encouraging and again, cajoling, sort of nudging, the political leaders in different countries to do it themselves. I mean, I can name, some countries where, for example, the issue of explaining what the big security challenges are, that war is no longer unthinkable. The politicians don't even want to talk about it. They say, well, let's leave it to our military. That's not exactly the job. I mean, the military have to play the role, but this is serious business, and the nature of today's war are such that, you can't just rely, we have this more philosophical point, but still important one. Netherlands is a good example. I remember talking to one of my previous bosses, also a Dutchman, Jaap Scheffer, who was telling me that because of the connotations that the war has in society, even he had difficulties when he was asked to help to establish a war studies department at one of the leading universities. Just the word war was considered. So you see, this is a challenge. But there are some very also specific things that you have to do. You have to show initiative as well. That's an important part, and that's one of the key issues, I think, is the question of relationship between NATO and EU and European Union. Although it's much better than it was. In fact, there is a relationship, and the EU itself has kind of stepped into the defense field, which was not the case before. But having said this, everybody's got a job to do, and one has to be careful, to avoid duplication. That was, by the way, the message from the outgoing Secretary General, which I think perhaps the new Secretary General would be wise, I'm sure he will, would take to heart, because, EU working on the issue of additional resources to beef up the defense industry capabilities in Europe. That's within EU's purview. But for instance, getting into the business of defense planning, that should not be EU's business, etc. So there's a lot of things, and the good thing is that Mark Rutte is an experienced head of state. I think he participated probably in more summits, both European Union and NATO's, than any other current leader. So he should bring that experience to fold. But the challenges are big, and so whatever the questions, and there were these questions asked about his commitment to various policies or support of policies, which, for example, Nord Stream 2, which were criticized rightly in many countries. But today he is the head of NATO, and he deserves support, and let's wish him good luck.
Right, wish him good luck indeed. And like you mentioned, challenges up ahead. We'll see how the situation unfolds. Meanwhile, thank you so much for your input and insight.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.